we use a lot of creativity in the work that we do, and it just stems from my own curiosity. All this interest in music and business and activism, all those things come from curiosity. It's like you just see a thread hanging and you just keep pulling on it until you get satisfied.
Scratch Entrepreneur. True stories of remarkable people who dropped everything to turn an idea into a healthy, profitable business. Us humans, we have all these labels for people, right? Some are mean, like calling someone a nerd or a moron. Some are self-applied, like goth or grunge. Some clearly state a specific spiritual philosophy, like Christian or pagan. Some are about ancestry, others skin color, still others define the generation you were born in. We have all these words as a way to categorize traits or behaviors, and all of it is a way for our brains to create boundaries. Wars are fought, rallies are held, weddings are arranged, all in the name of these boxes we create. When it comes to business, the words that create our box, our brand, are important too. We can incite love or hate, connection or ambiguity just by our choice of label, the words and actions that define us. What box have you created? For your business or your family? What set of words and actions define you? Spend a minute thinking about who's in and who's out. What does a VIP card mean in your club? The thing about labels is that they're powerful, they're sticky. If you sit back and consider the labels that define you, are you proud of them? Do they make your world, our world, just a little bit better? Who do they exclude? Understanding the boxes you create is step 1. Using them to foster healthy communities is step 2, 3, 4, and 10. Mastering this is how the best brands grow. Our guest today is in the business of labels, boxes, and building better brands. Labels that describe him would be extrovert, connector, describer, storyteller. Dmitry Vitsa has been building brands for decades. His business, Rock, Paper, Scissors, helps musicians, tech companies, and entrepreneurs of all kinds tell their story. In this episode, he tells his. Let's start from the beginning.
I don't have the paper route story that a lot of entrepreneurs have, or
Yeah, totally.
I wasn't selling like candy to my classmates or anything like that. But I do remember. I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, and lived my first 12 years there. And there was our local 7-Eleven, which, it was just like a hub for kids. And my older brother would go there to play video games. And, it's where I would go to buy candy and whatever. It was like a bike ride,
Yeah.
So I got into a situation where the manager of the store would have me come clean up his parking lot in exchange for a little payment. He would give me one of those 7-Eleven microwavable sandwiches and a big gulp. And
It sounds really good.
And the keys to the video games for the rest of the afternoon.
Oh, whoa, that sounds super good.
And I wasn't even that into the video games, but I was really into the idea of kind of earning that opportunity and having that kind of special, sort of role there. I think when I was really little, I was a little bit shy. And then as I got older, I really enjoyed the conversation and camaraderie of adults. Mm-hmm. So I think it was part of my early networking days.
Yeah, just like connecting and figuring out how to do that, right?
Exactly, yeah. So I think of that just because it sort of represented sort of what my personality was like as a kid. And we ended up moving to New York City, where I spent my teenage years. And like a lot of kids, I played music growing up. And I ended up getting into the city's School for Music and the Arts. It was the Fame High School. If anyone's ever seen that TV show, is based on this school. And so my attention was creative in a sense, was making a lot of music, although I wasn't as interested in what the school was teaching. It was very oriented on Western classical music. And by the time I hit high school, I was already kind of burned out. Yeah. It was a consciously diversified school. They had people from all parts of the city, all socioeconomic, cultural groups, and so forth. So a lot of my attention ended up going towards that kind of cross-cultural excitement and creativity of the kids. And this was New York in the 80s. And I actually like to say everything I learned about business, I learned about in the streets of New York, because I was heavily involved with activism there, doing a lot of anti-racism and cross-cultural work in New York City in the 80s when there was a lot of tension between different cultural groups.
Yeah. So you were connected with not only understanding the diversity of our world and all those kinds of things at an early age, but really advocating for those folks who maybe didn't have the same kinds of opportunities as other people did have.
You know, it was shocking to me. I'm of European descent, so I have what's commonly called white skin. And it was just shocking to me how prevalent racism was in New York at that time. And I say in that time just because we're talking about that time. I know it's not like it's gone away. But there was a lot of tension. And it just seemed so shocking that so many other people with lighter skin were just acted like everything was normal. And so that became a focus of mine. And that the activism really did hone my organizing skills, my business skills. I didn't think of it as business at the time, but I definitely did a lot of public speaking, marketing, motivation. You know, a lot of those things were involved with those times.
Yeah, I think activism and entrepreneurship are very similar in a lot of ways. I mean, you're going out there and advocating for something that you feel passionately about, and you're doing that to whomever will listen, and however the powers that be, you can break down or whatnot. So I see how those things are very similar.
And it's interesting, as I think about it over the years, like looking back, the spirit of entrepreneurship for me is a lot about my own independence and a lot about changing the world to be a better place. And it seems very tied to what my motivations were as an activist as well. And yet, the commercialism of entrepreneurship is very different than some of the social change kind of goals at the time. But I do think there's a way to kind of tie them together.
That's interesting, because you're right. I mean, when you're an entrepreneur, you're trying to make money. You're doing something that ultimately has a benefit to yourself in some monetary way. And obviously, social activism is more for the better good of all people. But you look at the great businesses, the ones that I look up to, they really can do both, and they use their power or their capacity as businesses to advocate socially and to do like Patagonia is a great example, like someone who just says, okay, we've got this business thing down, let's do some good with it. And I think I hadn't thought a ton about the connection between those two things until right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like now, I don't put a lot of thought into it either, but it always feels somehow connected, especially since the way my business started and kind of rolled out was still very tied to a lot of the same values and the same things I was thinking about.
So tell us a little bit about that. You started Rock, Paper, Scissors. What's the origin story there?
So I studied management in school. I actually ended up getting a full tuition scholarship to a private liberal arts school called Antioch College for my activism. So
wow, cool.
It's like I said, I didn't have a paper route. I wasn't like paying my way through college, but somehow my activism ended up paying my way through college, which is kind of cool. Yeah. And I did what probably whoever funded that scholarship would be rolling over in their graves. I went into management, business management. I was one of a very small handful of students from a very kind of progressive activist school that was interested in business. But part of it was I wanted to change the world through what I thought was a format that actually had an impact, and that was business and money.
Yeah, I mean, again, coming back to that, that's very interesting. So you went through Antioch, very connected with social activism again. Like that's kind of how you got connected with that school, but came out of it thinking about business and thinking about money, and graduated with a business marketing degree or a...
It was called a bachelor's in management.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And looking back on it, if I had chosen to go to a business school, I probably could have picked a more practical school, but it got me there, Yeah. So anyway, I out of school, I got a job working for an educational nonprofit in Portland, Oregon, and I was still doing some cross-cultural training, things like that. And I also had a musical interest this whole time. I mean, I was playing music in leading through high school and beyond, and I was listening to the progressive hip hop of the '80s, which led me to listening to the jazz samples that they used in the music, which led me to listening to the African origins of jazz, and the Queens Public Library in Flushing, Queens, where I lived. I was checking out tapes from all over the world, cassettes. Yeah. Those are little plastic things that preceded CDs.
Totally.
And, making my own little mixtapes of like Croatian folk music with Afrobeats founder Fela Kuti, which is kind of an African kind of funk style. And so I was just kind of like on my own on the side, continuing to kind of study the cultural side of music. Eventually, somebody in Portland that was at a record distributor invited me to help them set up their PR department. I had never done PR, but she knew I was interested in all these global music forums, and they had a lot of global music. So she knew that I would be good at doing that stuff. So that's when I kind of got my feet wet doing PR.
Yeah.
And got to do a lot of international music, so-called world music, but also jazz and pop and new age and other stuff. And then after a couple of years of doing that, I said, you know what? I want to pick my projects.
Yeah.
I want to be my own boss. I wanted that independent spirit. I still want to get things done, but I kind of want to be the one that's in charge of what I do.
Yeah.
And that's when I left to start Rock Paper Scissors, a PR firm that focused on global music.
Okay, cool. When was that?
I started the company in 1999.
Okay, cool. So you started the company in Portland?
That's right. I was there for a year after, I was there for 7 years, but Rock Paper Scissors was only there for a year before we moved here to Bloomington, Indiana.
Huh. Okay, cool. And so that it's been what, 13, 14 years?
That gets up to 18 now, almost 19.
Okay, so it's been 19 years since you did that. You started connecting with world music, connecting with bringing world music to particularly American listeners?
That's right. Yeah, we were getting hired by, at the time, at first it was record labels that were releasing music by artists from Africa and Latin America, Eastern Europe, really all over the place. Mm-hmm. And that was focused on album releases back then. I mean, we still do a lot of album release PR as well. And then eventually touring picked up more as the music industry shifted into more of the revenue was coming in through touring. There was more and more artists that were touring as well. So we've been doing PR for recordings and touring ever since then.
Huh. Okay, so we're going to dig more into the music industry and all things associated with what you do after the break. But before we go to break, I have one more question for you. And it has to do with your choice in clothing. So anyone who's ever connected with you knows that you love to wear colorful, amazing, very vibrant clothes. And it's just part of who Dimitri is, if you know Dimitri. And I guess as I was thinking about connecting with you, I was like, well, it might be fun to ask you why you make that choice and how that connects with you as a human being.
Well, cool. Yeah, I mean, I actually wore pretty bright clothes as a teenager into college and so forth. Now I wear even more extreme, what I refer to as crazy pants most of the time. I came across a pair of crazy pants and they just really appealed to me and I wore them. I go to a lot of conferences, a lot of industry conferences, and a friend of mine, a colleague from a performing arts center in San Francisco saw me in these pants at this conference and said, "Crazy pants." And I thought, well, she's talking to me, but she's talking about my pants. And I really thought, that's really who I am. That's really, like, it's a really good description. I mean, we use a lot of creativity in the work that we do, and it just stems from my own curiosity. All this interest in music and business and activism, all those things come from curiosity. It's like you just see a thread hanging and you just keep pulling on it until you get satisfied. And so I felt like the Crazy Pants was a good representation of that. And, when we talk to businesses or to artists, we talk about, like, what is your overall presentation? Mm-hmm. And it seemed like a good way to walk the walk. This represents my values around storytelling, story discovery, and helping artists and businesses. So,
all right, cool. So when we come back, we're going to dig into all those things. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
All right, we're back with Dimitri from Rock, Paper, Scissors. And Dimitri, I want to talk a little bit about the music industry. You've obviously been a part of it since the 80s. And you've seen the rise of the music industry. I think really the highest point was in the early, middle 90s. And then maybe some would say the fall. I mean, it depends on how you look at the way things have changed. How have you seen the music industry change in the time you've been connected with it?
It's been interesting because I did see kind of a shift from a real emphasis on recordings, and when physical recording sales started to decline, you saw an increase in live music at the same time. I mean, these festivals that everybody's going to and paying pretty big bucks to go to, there's so many more of those now, and they're so much more popular, these mega festivals now at this point. But even just touring artists overall, we saw the rise of Live Nation and many more large amphitheaters, as well as a whole robust club scene and performing arts scene. So, if people talk about the decline of the music industry because they're looking purely at physical sales,
Right.
but live music has grown at the same time. Merchandise sales has grown. And the other thing that most people don't realize, in spite of the conversations you hear about streaming services and YouTube and things like that, digital has almost made up for the loss in physical sales at this point.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And so a little bit about that, like the streaming element of music, has that felt like a positive, a negative? Like, what's your take on that part of it?
Well, my sense is it's a positive, and the reason it's a positive is because before any paid streaming services emerged, people were starting to consume music entirely for free.
Yeah.
With the emergence of Napster and the whole idea that people were doing peer-to-peer sharing of music that nobody was paying for anymore, there was no model for people to pay for digital music.
Right.
iTunes came along, and that helped to some extent. But streaming is really the first time where people feel like they have access to everything, and it's at a price point at which they're willing to pay for it. Now, maybe that price point will go up over time. Maybe per stream it'll go up over time. We're still in a transitional period. But because the consumption model shifted first, to me, streaming, especially paid subscription streaming, and to some extent advertised-supported streaming, is a positive thing because it recreated a model for monetization in music.
And you work with a lot of indie type music, and you work with like CD Baby, who works with a lot of indie musicians. Have you seen positives for any of those musicians associated with streaming?
There's a lot of different variables that are going on. I often think about, I don't know if you've ever seen this toy called Pendulum Man. It's shaped like a man, but it's a pendulum with pendulum arms and pendulum legs, and you spin it and you never know what the pendulums are going to do because of all the reactions and interactions and so forth. 1 minute it's spinning one way, the whole body, and then some arm starts flying everywhere and the whole body starts flipping the other direction. Yeah. I think the music industry and a lot of marketplaces and the economy is like the Pendulum Man. and so there's a lot of variables. Yeah. However, one of the trends that's happening that people don't realize is that more and more people are making and releasing recordings. Yeah. There was a time when there were about 10,000 titles released per year, and now it's tens of thousands. It's easily 5, 6, 10 times as many titles. And it's cumulative. Right. So the library of possible recordings you could listen to grows significantly every year. So that's a significant factor that people don't really recognize and don't acknowledge, that it's not just that monetization is different and tougher for independent musicians. It's also, there's a lot of competition. Yeah. And the other thing is there's whole other markets around, say, video games and video streaming that are competing for people's attention that used to be more dedicated to music. So the market is split up in a lot of other ways too. I mean, the Walkman was the mobile device. Remember? The CD Walkman, first the tape Walkman, and the CD Walkman. That was a mobile device. Now everybody has television in their pockets, and they have video, an endless source of arcade in their pockets. So there's all those factors too. But to answer your question, it is challenging, but there are musicians who are carving out new ways of managing their careers, and some of them pop, some of them don't. One CD Baby artist that we came across, a guy named Perrin Lamb in Nashville, had a record that he had put out a few years ago, and all of a sudden one of the tracks got picked up on a Spotify playlist, the Indie Coffee House playlist, and he made $90,000 in just a few months. Wow. And then another track got picked up by a playlist. He got another $30,000. So now here he is. He's got a day job. He still makes music. This is an old catalog title that he wasn't even promoting, and he ended up making an extra $120K that year. So, he's not a millionaire, but, that could contribute towards a mortgage.
Yeah, and I think anybody who's a creative person, you create this stuff and it either does well or it doesn't do well. And I think we all look for feedback and what people think about it. And the concept of some old thing you created a while ago and maybe didn't really pop, like suddenly popping, just seems like such a great story and such a cool scenario.
We organize a conference in Nashville for CD Baby called the DIY Musician Conference. About 1,500 people come to it. And a guy named Jack Conti came to speak there. He's one half of the duo Pomplamoose, and he's also the founder of Patreon, which is an interesting company as well. And his whole emphasis was the new model for the music industry is to keep creating music, keep creating content, that each song that you put out there is another potential source of income, and you just have to keep producing. It used to be you make an album, you tour around it, you sit on it for a year and so forth. It could be a couple of years. Yeah. Now he says just keep making that content, because each one of those is like a shingle, like a business person would put a shingle out and they're starting business. Well, a musician, each song is almost like its own little business. You never know what's going to take, how it's going to get used in film and TV, streaming, on tour, and so forth.
That's so cool too, because now you can take your music out in sort of the singles format, the old singles format, but it's just like that's what almost everything you do is,
Yeah, I mean, if you look at things like Vine, or you think some of those kind of karaoke style apps, it's not even a full single. You know what I mean? It's 7 seconds, as well.
Yeah. So the music industry has evolved over the course of the time you've been connected with it, and rock, paper, scissors has evolved as well. Can you tell us a little bit about, we started earlier in this conversation talking about how you were really supporting world music and its capacity to be heard around the United States. How has your business evolved to where it's at right now?
Well, I've always been really interested in technology, in the sense that we've used a lot of technology in our business. We've built our own relationship management system for how the publicists on our team do PR. We partnered with another company here in Bloomington called Sproutbox to launch StoryAmp.com, which is a automated music PR platform for musicians and managers and agents and so forth. And so we were always interested in technology, but actually when we built StoryAmp, we were able to do PR for our own company for our launch, and we got a lot of great PR. We got a Billboard feature, and other industry trade publications were covering this, and so other companies started to take notice of our ability to do PR for music technology companies. And CD Baby we mentioned, which distributes 600,000 independent artists, puts them on Spotify and helps them with YouTube monetization and Google Play and iTunes and Apple Music and all that stuff. Well, we met them at South by Southwest, a big conference in Austin, Texas, that includes both technology and music. And we started talking about, well, maybe we could help them out with PR. So for a solid year or two, they were our only kind of technology-related client. And then we attracted another one, and then another one. And then before you knew it, now about 2/3 of our PR work is for technology companies. Many of them in the music industry, but not solely in the music industry. We're also working in financial technology, in marketing technology, in augmented reality in the sports industry. So it's broadening out from there. So that was a significant pivot for us. And what was interesting is that I always thought the PR we did for world music was almost esoteric by mainstream standards. But the truth is, just like artists talk about having limitations to create kind of a further mastery or to be extra creative, we had to be super creative with world music stuff. And we found out that the story was such an important part of those artists. If you couldn't understand the language, you never heard the melodic structures, harmonic structures, rhythmic modalities, all those things were unfamiliar to the audiences that we were targeting. We went to other kinds of stories. We went to the economic conditions, the social conditions, the political conditions, the personal stories of the musician, the hybrids of how they mix different things together to create a modern sound. So we always dug deep on stories, and we realized when we started working with technology companies, it's almost the exact same thing, but we had this kind of creative well from the musical experience to express the most compelling components of a business story in ways that other businesses weren't expressing them.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about, I love that, because now you're really digging into the telling of stories. And as a PR firm for almost whoever, I mean, you named a bunch of different types of places. I think you realized that world music is where you started, but the formula you used, or the capacity to tell stories, works for other types of businesses as well. For the businesses that are out there trying to tell their own story, what pieces of advice do you have for them as to how to find that story?
Well, I mean, the first thing to do is to not look at press releases by other companies.
Yeah.
The reason being is that press releases have become this kind of formulaic methodology. People are always proud to present and they're celebrating anniversaries. And it ends up, you use language that ends up being so cliche that it's ignorable, that journalists or stakeholders, investors, employees, any of those people, when you use the kind of terminology that everybody else is using, it just becomes totally ignorable. So that's step one, is don't do what everyone else is doing, you know?
Absolutely. Okay.
And then I think the other thing is to think about, actually, your interview is a great example of how you get to stories. I mean, starting with the origin story is really great. We love to start with the origin story with founders to understand what drives them. It's very similar to the questions you've been asking me, actually.
Yeah, story arc and like building that story arc, starting from the beginning.
Yeah, and also it's I mean, we think a lot about like throwing out fishing nets and gathering stuff, and sometimes you don't know exactly what you're gathering, but you're sort of like, sometimes you want to come at it from a side angle. You know, you don't want to just you see all the fish, you don't want to just throw a line right in and scare them off. You might put in some nets somewhere that sort of start to gather things up, and then you pull it up and start to sift through and look for the gems. Sometimes the gems are a little bit rough and you actually need to polish them a bit. So we always say that we are deep lovers of the follow-up question, because people oftentimes in business, they have the initial answer to that question.
Right.
But then when you hear a kernel of something that makes you like, well, that sounds a little off, or that's a little bit curious. Wait, you just said that as if everyone says that. What did you really mean by that? Yeah. So I think sometimes businesses have to have an outside perspective. And I'm not saying you have to hire a PR firm, but maybe somebody that's outside your business, ask them to interview you and ask them to get curious as well. But some people can do it themselves, just get curious. And some people know what's unique and compelling about their personal story and their business story. And I think that's the first question to say, is like, what truly makes you unique?
Yeah.
And the cool thing is, it's a great practice for publicity, but it's also great practice for business development.
Yeah.
Because if you can't differentiate yourself from others that are offering something similar, you're competing on price.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Exactly.
So you have to come up with what really differentiates you, what your true value is. And again, that may sound a little bit bland at the surface, but the deeper you go into that question with the follow-up and so forth, the more likely you're able to actually find out what's compelling, what's a good story.
Yeah. And you know, I was trying to get, okay, well, how can we do that for ourselves? Obviously, you connect with these businesses and you ask these questions and these follow-up questions, and you're looking for that gem that maybe they didn't even realize they had. And I was sitting there thinking, well, how can a business owner do it for themselves? And maybe the answer is, well, you have to understand that you really can't. So who can you have ask you questions? I mean, someone came in here a couple days ago for an article they're doing and just sat down and asked us all these questions about the podcast, about the business, about all the stuff we do. And when we walked away from it, Mackenzie and I really were like, wow, we just learned a lot more about our business, about who we are, about how we do things, about what our story is, than we could have ever learned by sitting in a room ourselves and trying to navigate that. So maybe it's just asking a friend to interview you, or asking someone to really ask you the hard questions, being a part of a mastermind, being a part of a group of business owners that ask each other to define who they are, what they do, and what their brand is. I think however you figure it out, the answer to finding out who you are and how you tell your story might be to ask someone to ask you.
I think it is a good option. I don't think it's the only option. I think some people are better story finders and storytellers than others for themselves even. So I don't think I think some people know that they know, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
but if you know that you don't know, or you don't know if you know.
Yeah, if you can't ask the question, why am I different? Or why am I interesting? Or why is my brand something that really my ideal client should want to have? If you can't answer that question, that's okay, but go find the answer.
And there's other opportunities too. I think, what motivates you, what got you into what you did, why did you follow this path versus a different path? That's all interesting. And you can ask those questions for you as an individual, as a founder or a CEO. You can also ask that question for your business too. Why did our business go in this direction? Yeah. And it's so funny to be answering these questions this way to you because you're doing it. And that's the other side of this. People think of PR as something that gets to journalism, gets to media coverage. But we think of PR almost as its own form of journalism. Like in terms of the story finding and the storytelling, the discovery and how you articulate it, how you come up with the most compelling way to do it. We think the same way that journalists and publications, media outlets do as well, podcasters as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
You want to come up with a great story. So I don't know. I'm not sure that's specific enough to be helpful to everybody that's listening, but it gives you a little bit of a sense. I guess another answer that can be really helpful is stories frequently focus around humans, around characters, around narratives. And so the more likely you can get to a human-oriented story, I think the increased chances you have of engaging people. You can say, so like we were talking about CD Baby. We can say CD Baby distributes 100,000 independent artists. What does that mean? You could talk a little bit about what that means, because distribution, blah, 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 like that's a music industry term.
Right.
But then we told the story about this guy in Nashville, right? So now you can actually picture, and you know what? You can't get onto iTunes and Spotify without either a record label or a distributor. So we say CD Baby is the on-ramp for the independent musician and music industry. You can't get onto that highway without some larger entity, and CD Baby is a self-service website you can go to get your music into all these distribution channels.
Yeah, and I love that like the short metaphor, the on-ramp. In fact, I've heard you say that before, the on-ramp to the music industry, and I've been thinking about it for like the last week or two, that line. And sometimes storytelling can be longer, and sometimes storytelling is 5 words.
That's true, yeah.
And that example, like I already have a picture in my mind, I have a story in my head about a certain business from 5 words.
That's good, yeah.
I think that's really cool.
So we looked at all the ways we could talk about CD Baby, and we kind of tackled them one by one with different stories. Some of them are human interest stories about musicians. Some of them are about new technical features that differentiate the company from others. Some of them are about partnerships with other companies to show where they're aligned, or new services they're adding, and so forth. And so you kind of like turn the company like 2 degrees at a time until you get a 360-degree picture of what the story is. Yeah. But so we can talk about things more generally, like, well, one of the interesting things, like I was talking about before, about the music industry is that more people are creating music. One of the interesting things about the independent music scene is that now everybody who wants to create music and record it can actually get it into the pocket of everybody who has Spotify on their phone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's not just comparing what the old music industry is like with the new one. It's also about the fact that there's hundreds and thousands of more people who are making music and getting it out there, which is a really compelling story.
Yeah, it's super cool. And if you're a musician, like to know you can get it out there more, and and be a part of that community is really cool. So when we come back, I'm going to ask you some kind of quick fire questions about being a business owner, just giving some insights to folks, and then we'll sew it up and we'll be done. All right?
Sounds good.
All right, we're back with Dimitri Vița. And Dimitri, we've talked a little bit about the PR work you've done for World Music. We've talked about how you kind of took that into almost the music technology world. And now you're coming to connect with a lot of technology companies, specifically tech, not necessarily connected with music at all.
That's right.
How is what you're doing really great for that type of company?
The music technology world is pretty much just the music version of all the tech stuff. So they're dealing with the same types of kind of issues and dynamics of any other technology companies. People still think of them as music related, but a lot of them are software as a service companies. They're platform companies, different companies that were doing business to business things. They just happen to be in music. Yeah. But they're facing the same issues of, I hate to use the word disrupting because it's kind of overused, but that's really what's happening. Yeah. Or as our friends and recent client Developer Town say, software is eating the world. Yeah. And that's really true. And so we've got a lot of experience in the music business for that, and it's starting to expand out from there as well. And one of the things that really works well for us is the same themes that came up for us when we were involved with world music, came up in music technology, are coming up in other types of technology as well. Issues of access. I mean, a lot of the changes that are happening in technology are increasing everybody's access, and it has its pluses and its minuses. On the one hand, everybody's on all the time now. They have access to each other 24/7, which has its own kind of lifestyle issues. But on the other hand, that means there aren't as many gatekeepers.
Yeah.
People can start businesses or careers without needing to ask for permission or to jump through as many hoops. And then it all rests on their own, and then they have to figure out all the different software programs and apps to help them run a business without any support and so forth. But so access is an interesting one. Equity is an interesting one too. As you have more access, there's the likelihood and the possibility of people who wouldn't have the ability to run businesses or to have success.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting one. Transparency comes up a lot across a lot of these technology companies. Now that everything's so interconnected, people are interconnected, data is interconnected, there's issues of transparency across a lot of industries where people are starting to expect to be able to see what the financials of something are and so forth.
Yeah,
and of
absolutely.
course, innovation would be another one, which sounds kind of obvious, but the same reason that I got into all the music stuff and all the cross-cultural stuff has to do with exposing myself to new ideas, putting seemingly unrelated ideas together. One of my favorite books is The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen, which talks about disruption, but then he did a follow-up book called The Innovator's DNA, which I've not heard very many people talk about, but he talks about what are the elements that lead to innovation for the innovator. What are the skills that it takes to be an innovator? And the primary skill is the ability to put seemingly unrelated things together. So it's interesting to me that that's what I was doing with global music all along.
Yeah.
I was interested in how traditional cultures were merging with, quote, modern day cultures or across cultural borders and so forth to create something new. And that's what's happening in all these technology companies. They're taking one idea and applying it to another field or applying it to another idea. So he talks about, so Clayton Christensen talks about putting seemingly unrelated things together to create innovation. And then the other characteristics or skills of an innovator are things to come up with more ideas. So networking, asking questions, doing research, meeting people, all of those things are the things that give you new data, new sources to combine for innovation.
And so your connection with the technology companies is really kind of bringing all those things together and helping a company to bring those things together and to ultimately bring that out to the market and into the world.
You know, what it is for me is that we are using some of those themes that if you look at the 100,000-foot view above planet Earth and you look down at what are the patterns that are happening in society, identifying how these companies fit into those narratives. Because we're all experiencing all this dynamic, amazing shifts in how we live and how we use technology. And these companies all have a little part to play. And it goes back to what we were talking about, storytelling. What's the compelling thing? What differentiates you? A lot of times it's like, what puzzle piece do you fit into this new world that we're experiencing, but we can't even describe because it's unfolding so quickly? And so all of those themes that I'm talking about become great sources for the stories as well. How are you increasing access? What are those unrelated ideas that you've put together in the most interesting way? And so forth.
And that's super cool. All right. Last question, really. What does rock, paper, scissors look like in 5 years?
Well, that's a good question. I'm constantly sort of reflecting on where I want things to go, and some of it you have influence over, and some of it's like riding a wave. You kind of have to go with the current a little bit. I feel like this shift into more PR for non-music related stuff is a significant growth area for us. Yeah. It's not where we are quite yet because we're still doing a lot of music technology. About 2/3 of our business is technology, and most of that is in music, but we're starting to add these other pieces. And so I think that will be a growing area. I would say we'll be twice as big. We're at 15 people now. I suspect in 5 years we'll probably be twice as big. And the other piece is we're doing some really innovative stuff in PR that I have not heard of anyone doing other than our partners from the UK that we refer to as story finding or story discovery, which is where in larger communities or larger corporations, you use kind of a crowdsourced version or opportunity to get stories from your employees and from your users and your customers. So instead of having kind of like the headquarter office telling all the stories to the masses, you have the masses telling their stories and somebody that's a story finder kind of curating those gems and bringing them up and using these human interest stories to tell the story of a company or a brand or an organization. And part of it's related to the low trust barometer. There's a big communications firm called Edelman that does a trust barometer every year. Trust is at an all-time low. Yeah. It's a little bit related to politics. It's a little bit related to some of this increase of access and transparency, some of those issues where people just don't trust leaders as authorities in the ways they used to. Yeah. And people trust what other people like them have to say.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So there's a new story finding opportunity there that I think brings in more voices to how you do PR.
Yeah, and I think that, so many things in life as human beings are circles, and I think the concept that we now trust our neighbors in a way, and we don't trust leaders, or business owners as much, or large corporation owners, is not a new concept in any way, shape, or form, but now it's sort of feeding into the PR world and the brand world that we want to just hear from each other, who we are. We want to hear from employees of a business, not necessarily the CEO. And that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean we don't necessarily trust the CEO or whatever. We just want to hear from people who we feel like really do connect with us.
Well, you know what else is interesting? As you were saying that, I was just thinking, and this is not something that I've consciously thought before, is people are so into kind of the Netflix era and podcast era, for that matter, of stories. I mean, in a way, it's kind of weird, and I'm sure the publishing industry is not crazy about it. I think people are still reading a lot of books still, but it feels like people are kind of digging in even deeper into the idea of stories through TV. I mean, TV is having a crazy renaissance in terms of the variety of things that you can watch, and the types of stories that are getting told are way more diverse. There's so many more opportunities there that I think that in itself is having an impact on how people perceive PR, because they're used to stories. And so, and also this breakdown between what is business and what is entertainment, and what is commerce and what is entertainment. Everything is entertainment now.
Everything is everything now. Yeah.
Yeah, and everything is everything. That's right. So that's kind of an interesting thing I think that's happening psychologically as people are like ingesting so many more stories. That's what they're getting used to hearing.
So if someone wants you to help them tell their story, maybe they're a business in the music industry, or maybe they're a business in the tech industry, or maybe they're just a business that's curious about whether you can help them tell a story for them, how can they communicate with you and connect with you?
Best way is to just go to our website, rockpaperscissors.biz, B-I-Z. Scissors is a hard word. If I had realized how much trouble people have spelling scissors, SCISSORS.biz, B-I-Z. And we've got a contact section there. That's a great place to go. You can find us on Facebook, on Rock, Paper, Scissors Music, and on Twitter, RPS Music or RPS Tech. If you could spell my name, you can find me on Twitter too.
Cool. Well, Dimitri, it's so awesome to get to chat with you, hear a little bit about your business, your thinking, your storytelling. It's been a pleasure, and we really appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, it's been great talking with you, and I really love what you're doing with Scratch Entrepreneur and with Shine Insurance.
Special thanks to Dimitri Vitsev for taking the time to share the rock, paper, scissors story with us. This show was produced and edited by me, Jeremy Goodrich. The music is by my good friend, Mark Vinton. In college, we would get together most Friday nights and play music to the wee hours of the morning. Here's the thing, though. He lived in a tiny apartment with about 200 neighbors. We had a drum set, amplifiers, and we loved to turn it up. Kinda can't believe that the cops only showed up twice. If you enjoyed this podcast, there's a couple of things we need you to do right now. First, subscribe to Scratch Entrepreneur on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts so you can hear future episodes as soon as we release them. While you're there, please give the show a review. We'd love to know what you liked, what you didn't, and what you want to hear next. Until the next time, we truly appreciate you listening.